Thank you very much, Bill. Good to hear from you. And the only announcement I have is in regards to the services that are held in this hall on the 1st, 3rd, and 5th Sabbaths of the month. So for those attending locally, we are, we have been coming to set up the hall the evening prior because it's kind of a rush, I wouldn't call it a mad rush, but it's a rush to get things set up in the morning before everybody arrives, and so we're arriving a little bit later because we don't need as much time to set up, but we plan on being here by 10:30. So the doors will be open at 10:30 for those that are attending locally. So you can keep that in mind. And living with 3 girls, being on time with things in the past has been quite a bit of a challenge. But things have got kind of improved some. It's okay. In any case, so yeah, interesting weather we've been having. I know we always talk about the weather. Hey, how's it going out there? How's the weather? But wow, last 2 days have been in the low 60s or upper 50s. And today is supposed to be 66. Well, they are getting freezing temperatures down south, even as far as Virginia. And so watching a bit of the weather yesterday, so it's pretty interesting what's going on. I can't say I'm complaining. It's kind of nice here, living in Montana, to have 60-degree weather in what is supposed to be winter. But we'll see how it plays out going forward. Let's turn over to 1 Thessalonians and chapter 5. It is not news to anyone that Western culture and fashion has had some surprising changes in the last several decades. Obviously, there have been some drastic changes when it comes to politics and religion, or the lack thereof. But when it comes to the way people dress, the style of hair, makeup, body piercings, tattoos, these are things that fall into the categories of fashion and culture. They've been around for thousands of years, though. It's something that has always evolved, if I might say, or changed to a degree as time presses on. Styles come and go, and we know that sometimes styles come back around again. It's not unusual today for us to see some people that have styles likened to things of the 1940s or the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, and in the last several years we're seeing a resurgence of things that were fashionable in the 1980s. Fashion from the 1990s, which is kind of, I guess, I associate, or I should say I can relate to that culture to a large degree. The 1990s, I think, was widely a conglomerate of a variety of fashions, and it added an element of what's called grunge, and that, I guess you can't call it culture. I'd call it more fashion than culture. But it's basically grunge. Just means a bit disheveled is kind of what it points to. But all of these things that we see are active today in our culture. And for the most part, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with wearing clothes or styling hair or what have you in ways that are considered fashionable. Culture has very much influence in the lives of anyone that lives in a particular society. And what might seem to be unusual in one culture might be common in another. Now, America has long been a melting pot of people, and in this way, styles or fashions. While multiculturalism in regards to government and religion is not a good thing for the West, but when it comes to certain styles, whether it be of architecture or decor or clothing or what have you, those things can be enjoyable and quite beautiful, actually. But in an age where fashion can also be considered bizarre, shocking, risque, and even to some offensive, it is something that the Church of God has to consider. We all have to consider it to a degree so that we maintain a level of propriety. Some might say that propriety in this regard, well, that's subjective, and you can't judge a book by its cover, right? Well, that's correct. But does that mean we can never, have some kind of an opinion of a person because of their clothes or makeup or piercings or tattoos or what have you? Well, I think in many times we can't. We can't judge people in that way, but it's not entirely accurate to say that people are not to form any kind of opinion of anyone, regardless of how they dress or what they might have on their body. Now, sometimes the character of a person can be reflected. We have to admit, it can be reflected in the way the person appears. And we, as Christians, as people who are God-revering people, we don't want to get mixed up with those things that some might consider to be improper or indecent. The Apostle Paul instructed many Gentile congregations with different cultures and styles of dress, congregations all throughout the Middle East, into Asia Minor, and these people were influenced by where they lived, the culture in which they lived. And Paul gave brethren in Thessalonica a list of disciplines. I'm not going to go through the entire list. I'm going to focus on one part of this list, but he gave a list of disciplines that apply to all people who revere God, regardless of the era in which we live or the culture in which we live. And among them is something that can be applied to us in a variety of ways. In 1 Thessalonians 5, in verse 22, it says, to abstain from every form of evil. Evil, we know, comes in many different forms. It's not restricted to a tall or a short person or a male or female or white, brown, black, red, or whatever the ethnicity might be. Every sin is a form, if you will, of evil, but the expression here is not just symbolic of different people and of various sins. Now, I'm reading from the New King James Version of the Bible, which is similar to the King James Version, very similar, but there are times when one or the other has a better, in my opinion, or more accurate rendering of the original text. So in this case, the King James rendering of the Greek eidos is a term that means view, appearance, fashion, as in something that is seen. And so the King James reads, abstain from all appearance of evil. So this includes evil that comes in different forms or appearances, and it includes those things that to some might look like they are leaning in the direction of evil or sin. So in other words, avoiding that which looks like evil or carries a suspicion of evil, of wrongdoing, because it might mislead others. It might misrepresent us. Now, interestingly, the definition of this term form, which is also translated as appearance of evil, the definition includes the word fashion, as in something that is made. But what are fashions that we are familiar with? The fashions, where do they come from? People make them. They come up with them. They come up with ideas about it, and some of them become trendy and some do not. So they're created by people, and different styles and also behaviors can fall into this category as well as being a part of fashion and culture. Because some cultures, frankly, we We have to be honest and say some cultures are more evil than others. Ancient Egypt had a vastly idolatrous culture, Roman Hellenism. Not positive for the most part. They had a lot of great triumphs when it came to ingenuity, architecture, and what have you, but as far as the culture of religion, terrible. The Aztec and Mayan cultures, they built amazing structures, but widely an evil culture. So the reason for Paul's advice to the church, which, again, as a reminder, it's included among a list of Christian disciplines. It's a good idea to go over all of them occasionally. The reason is for us to be associated not with that which is evil, but with the good. To be considered good people, decent people. Because being a person that reveres God, it's not just about us. Yeah, it has much to do with the heart, but it's not just about us. We have to consider, how do others perceive us? So Christians, they also carry the name of God. Think about it. Right in the name. Christ, a Christian. And so we therefore should represent something that's proper and decent. The kind of propriety God wants us to have. And so appearance, it includes conduct as well as how we look. As the saying goes, we dress for success. Because the desired result should be, as it says in verse 23 of the same chapter, may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your whole spirit, soul, and body be preserved blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, that's what we want, to be considered sanctified by God, preserved blameless entirely. Now, it doesn't mean we're never going to sin. We are going to make mistakes, and we will sin. But there's much that can be avoided, We have to be forthright about this, honest with ourselves. We can avoid much. So when it comes to fashion in the country where we live, and other nations as well that have Western culture, the concerns for avoiding an appearance of evil they vastly have to do with 5 things, which I'm going to cover in brief today. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. I'm trying to make this a sermon not too long. So they have to do with clothing, hairstyles, makeup, piercings, and tattoos. Now, there are others that can be involved in this, but I'm focusing on those today. It could be said that something appearing as risque or outrageous to some in our culture might be considered tame or common in others. But there is a level of decency. Admit it, there's a level of decency that is held by the majority, and that should be considered. So we have to generalize. In order to be, honest and make sense of things, we have to generalize on occasion to make sure that we are covering, this is what the majority thinks or how they feel. Of course, God does consider the heart. Now, that definitely is something that we consider as well. We have to consider the heart of a person, which we don't know. We don't always know how that person is inside or what they are thinking. That is the most important thing to God. But that doesn't mean that we should therefore disregard how we dress simply because we're a good person on the inside. I mean, Christian living is both inward and outward. It's lived, there's 2 sermons that we had given in the past on that subject about living the way of God from the outside in and from the inside out. You can't pick and choose one or the other. And while God's focus, his main concern is our ethic, of course, and how we apply his law, that is keeping his commandments. He has an opinion about that, obviously, but it doesn't mean he doesn't care about anything else. He cares about the smaller things that we might consider to be of lesser importance. Psalm 33 is one of several verses indicating this, where it says, and this is Psalm 33 and verse 13, that the Eternal looks from heaven. He looks on all the inhabitants of the earth. And in verse 15, he says, he considers all their works, not just some, all of their works. And so God, he is not omnipresent, as some people insinuate, that God is everywhere. He's in everything. No, he's not. He's not all over the place, all over the world. But he knows everything. He can be wherever he wants to be. And he knows what's going on in all the details of our lives, of everyone's lives. And of course, God considers the big picture of who we are. However, another saying, the devil is in the details, there's a truth to that. There's truth to that. And conversion is a process. And conversion is a process that for some people it may begin with the big things, keeping the commandments, keeping the Sabbath, making sure we're in line with the Big Ten. For others, it might begin with subtleties, doing a little here and a little there. As growth in knowledge occurs, and with that, the growth in grace, which means God's influence on our mind and how we apply that influence in our lives, these other things need to be considered as well, big or small. Because God looks at the big picture, yeah. And that big pictures include lots of details. So God sees every stroke of the brush of our lives, and perfection, which basically means maturity, it comes not just with age, but it comes with increased knowledge and an application of that knowledge as, God gives us spiritual maturity in the conversion process. I had said in a sermon a few weeks ago that God is not in the business of micromanagement, and I believe that. But God gives us guidelines so that we can micromanage our lives, so that we can apply his standards to nearly everything that we choose to do, including the outward appearance. Let's turn over to 1 Timothy, just a page or two, 1 Timothy in chapter 2. And so fashion has always been a manner in which most people choose attire. Not the wheel on your car, but clothing. Some may simply choose what is comfortable regardless of how it looks. Nothing wrong with that. But again, generally speaking, there are few that disregard what is appealing and acceptable in our culture. Women, for example, once wore dresses that went down to the ankle. That was more than a century ago when that was commonplace. It still happens today, but it's not common. And then as time pressed on and fashions changed, hems moved to just under the knee and then above the knee. At one time, if a woman or a teenage girl wore a mini skirt, something that showed her knees, it would, or even just showed their knees, it would raise eyebrows. Whoa, daring, risque. Now it's common. Mini skirts are common. But mini skirts in and of themselves are not evil. They've been around for thousands of years, actually. It's how they are applied. So the earliest, when I looked at it, the earliest evidence of mini skirts date back to ancient Egypt, which, some people say, oh yeah, look at that culture. Yeah, I guess you can look at it that way. But the point is, propriety can depend on culture and, of course, the social event. You're not going to wear a full-length dress down to your ankles to the beach or to a swimming pool party. It depends on the event. Now, one of the verses, I'm going to mention a few things that talk about clothing here, and one of them is in 1 Timothy in chapter 2, in verse 9. Yes. In like manner, also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Now, like the rest of the Bible, rational thought is required in order to understand what exactly is modest and proper and moderate. Now, the terms, they speak of appearances that are orderly, meeting or reflecting good behavior, not drawing too much attention to oneself. Now, that might sound drab for some people, or plain, some might call it, but it doesn't mean that women can't be fashionable, or they cannot, wear things that are appealing to the eye, or they can't show, too much their elbows or their kneecaps. That's not what is being referenced here. It depends on how it's applied, on what the culture is as well, has an influence on this. Now, I'm not going to go through it all, and I'm not going to declare to everybody what's proper when it comes to showing some of their skin. I have an opinion about everything, as we all do. But it only takes some common sense to figure out what propriety is in our culture. What's appropriate for the occasion? What is our motivation? Doing yard work or going to the beach is very different than going to a church service. And of course, this principle, which Paul expresses to women here, it doesn't apply just to women, it applies to men as well. The point is to consider is, what kind of person are we trying to reflect? What is our motive in what we wear, just as in what we do? Even though a book cannot be judged by the cover, the tendency of human nature is to get an idea of what the book is like from looking at the cover. Few people are going to purchase a book if they don't like what the cover says or how it looks. And, we shouldn't therefore expect people to entirely disregard first impressions. Some people are better at doing this than others, but like it or not, that's just the way human nature is, and we're not going to change human nature anytime soon. Another trend in our age is for men to appear effeminate and even attempt to be considered feminine. Now, this is not a problem in the Church of God, so I'm not going to go into all the reasons why this is a problem, but I'm going to mention it just briefly because of the subject matter. So, cross-dressing and things like that is something that God considers to be confusion, backwards, upside down, immoral, and indecent. Deuteronomy 22 and verse 5 is one of the places where it says, "A woman shall not wear anything that pertains to a man, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment. For all who do so are an abomination to the eternal your God." So such behavior, it's confusion when it comes to God creating man and woman. Male and female, he created them, designed to have many different traits. But these work together wonderfully in a family, or at least they're supposed to. It's a challenge for both men and women. But God wants us to have that challenge because he knows when we face it and when we overcome it, a wonderful thing comes out of that relationship. So just as homosexuality, therefore, is an abomination leaning in the direction of homosexuality, as in transgenderism or, what do they call it, cross-dressing, things like that those are detestable to God. And so they should be to us. Now, when we go back to the propriety of clothing that is for women and clothing that is for men, what is proper and modest in this regard, I'm not going to spell it out for everybody, but I'm telling you, and be honest with yourself, it's not difficult to figure out. Even though fashion and culture can change over time, there continues to be standards that maintain a level of decency and standards for a particular occasion. So this does not mean that we have to disregard fashion, that we should disregard culture or styles or trends and dress like our grandparents did, 100 years ago or something. That's not what I'm talking about, because among all cultures, there are different styles. There are different ways to apply them. And so how we choose to apply them and for what purpose, that is the concern. That is the biggest concern, I should say. In 1 Peter in chapter 3, the next topic I want to mention in this regard is makeup. Now, I don't have much to say about makeup. We've talked about this in our group in the past in our discussions after services. Both Art and I have answered several emails, questions about makeup in the past. And the reason I don't have a whole lot to say about it is because I believe it is not the ministry's place to make doctrinal decisions about things that are not specifically stated in the Bible. I have an opinion. We all have our opinions, right? Now, but there are some in the ministry that have made doctrinal decisions in the past about makeup, saying that makeup should be avoided, claiming that the few mentions of makeup in the Bible refer to it as being evil. Now, the verses that have been referenced are, and I'll give you the list, there's only 3 of them. If you want to look them up, you can. It's Jeremiah 4 in verse 30. It is also Ezekiel 23 and verse 40, and also 2 Kings 9 and verse 30. And I think you'll find what I did when we looked it up some time ago, and if you look it up, my conclusion is the same today, that none of those verses actually say that God has a problem with people using makeup. The issue that is discussed in those scriptures is how the makeup was used. It has been misused by many for thousands of years. It still continues to be misused today, but the Bible actually never says that makeup is wrong, that it should be avoided. The ways in which these people used it should be avoided. However, we also need to always be honest about what the scriptures say and what they don't say, and the Bible doesn't say that God approves of makeup either. So, again, it goes back to what's the motivation? What is the reason that we want to use makeup? And the only advice that I will offer in this regard is the same advice that Paul offered when it came to clothing or attire in Thessalonians. Modesty should be the approach. What is proper should be the approach. Now, I'm going to move right on to the next subject of this topic, which is hairstyles. And I should mention a few things about them. One of them we had read already, so I won't go back there, but we had read in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 9, where it said that the adorning of women in modesty should not include braided hair with golden pearls. Now, with all the ways that women can braid their hair, that would seem to include a variety of styles that in our culture has widely been viewed as being not only modest and proper, but innocent, quite sweet. Braiding a child's hair has been common in this culture for hundreds of years. Most women and girls with braided hair, they actually intend to, portray a sense of innocence or meekness. Some will use ribbons in their hair or some other decorations. And when it comes to other, types of jewelry, the rings, bracelets, necklaces, earrings, what have you, whether or not they are precious metals or stones, they've been used for a long, long time. And so I don't believe that's what Paul was referring to, is to never braid your hair and never wear jewelry if you're a woman. I think he was advising women to be careful of why you're doing it. What's the motive? I think that's the issue that Paul was talking about. Because in Paul's time, according to the culture of his time and the fashion at that time, women being adorned like that were well known for making a show of themselves, that they wanted to be singled out or pointed out or gawked at. And usually the reason was to attract men. So he was advising women, don't look like that. Don't appear as those women of ill repute. And the instruction that he gave compares to the Apostle Peter's advice for wives, but this applies to all women. This is 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3 and verse 1 says, "Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. And when they observe your chaste conduct, accompanied by fear, do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God." So Paul was not telling women here, I'm sorry, this is Peter now. Peter was not telling women not to dress up, not to, make yourself look pretty or beautiful with the type of clothing you wear or how you style your hair. In fact, he said, don't let it only be outward, but let it be inward. So it seems like, he was okay with women doing that. There's nothing wrong with it, actually. Again, it's the point. What is the purpose? Modesty doesn't mean avoiding any kind of pleasant appearance. It's a matter of finding a balance so that there's a respectful persona maintained. So the intent of the person that is doing the adorning to themselves, that is really of great importance. And also we have to consider the way the appearance is perceived by others. In 1 Corinthians in chapter 8, 1 Corinthians 8, something we are seeing more and more of today is people with rainbow colors in their hair, whether it be blue or green or bright reds, yellows and oranges. They're becoming more and more frequent. But women and also men have long dyed their hair. Now, of course, the common dyeing of hair has usually been to blend the gray that comes with age, but many women have bleached their hair in order to appear blonde or perhaps dyed it to appear brunette. Some people even attempted to become a ginger or a redhead because that is a really special color of hair among women. It's something that actually has been considered acceptable in our culture when it comes to that type of dyeing. The unusual part of it comes with these rainbow type colors. But even among that, there have been women who do highlights in their hair, whether, blonde streaks or some add a bit of color in their hair. And again, to be forthright and entirely honest, which I always try my hardest to be, and if I'm not, it's not on purpose, none of it violates the scriptures unless it's the intent of the person. So what those people who color their hair should consider is, again, propriety and modesty. What is proper? What is considered modest? Is how we style our hair in an attempt to stand out, to appear unusual or radical? Do we want people to gawk? Is it going to cause some people to stop and stare or think ill of us? Is that what we want? And I assume that those people that have, heads with brightly colored blue and green hair, that's probably what they want, because it is, it's probably like, whoa, look at the color. Yeah, it does make you stop and look. Now, at one time in Western culture, men who entirely shaved their heads were considered skinheads. I'm very familiar with that culture. I was never a skinhead, but I was a part of the punk generation. And skinheads is a term referring to radical punks that have fascist tendencies, or at least most of them did. It was not viewed as appealing or positive at all, even among the punk culture that I was a part of. Most of us did not approve of skinheads. But instead, the shaved head in that way, it was done for more of a shock value. And maybe that's why God said that priests shall not shave their heads. Not because they would be associated with skinheads, but because of the shock value. Today, a shaved head, though, has become acceptable and proper for some men to have. And you're going to see businessmen with shaved heads. You'll see even Christians that have entirely shaved heads. Now, my thoughts are, of course, probably for most of them anyways, is the reason they're doing it is because they're balding. And the alternative is not attractive to them, so they prefer to shave their head. But whatever the reason is, there's nothing wrong with it, unless you're a priest in the temple. And I'll mention that scripture in a moment. Shaved heads has become something that's fashionable. It's a part of our culture. Other hairstyles, and I'm not going to go into all of them today, but they should be considered on a case-by-case basis. But it doesn't take much thought, really, when we are honest about it and we consider the propriety. Those styles that are considered to be radical or rebellious, they should be avoided. I think we should avoid them, even if they don't violate the scriptures, because it may be an offense to others. It could cause others to think ill of us or misrepresent ourselves. Now, Paul said something about this when speaking to the congregations in Corinth. And when he wrote this, he was actually talking about eating meat that came from an animal that was used in a sacrifice or offering to an idol. And some had chose to purchase that meat in the marketplace, likely because it was cheaper much of the time because there was much of it. But using that meat as for food was offensive to some people in the church, even though it was clean meat. It was not an unclean animal. That was never the issue of unclean animals. That was always to be avoided. The issue was clean meat offered to idols. And Paul said that if it offends some people, some of your brethren, don't do it. In 1 Corinthians 8, in verse 9, it says, "But beware lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak." In other words, you can eat that meat. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just meat. The idol is no thing. It's not really a god. It doesn't taint the meat. But the view of some that the meat is tainted, that becomes an issue. Because then they'll think ill of you. Or it might cause them to stumble in some other way. They might sin because of your liberty. So it goes on to say in verse 10, For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things that are offered to idols? And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. So in other words, it wasn't breaking a commandment to eat that meat, but it becomes a sin when you're offending the brother in this way. And he says, he even compares it to sinning against Christ, that Christ would not do this if it offended someone. So we should not do it either. And there's a principle in this of avoiding a reason for a person to stumble because of our liberty, because we're able, because in our mind it doesn't violate the scriptures. But we could become a part of that sinful process if it causes somebody else to sin, even if it unknowingly we move them to that place. In 1 Corinthians 11, if you turn over a page or two, the other thing Paul mentions about fashion and culture is the length of hair on women as opposed to men. In 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 13, he said, "Judge among yourselves." In other words, what I think he's relating is this isn't difficult for you to figure out. Judge it among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. So Paul wrote that there are particular styles of hair for women that are not for men, and it includes hair that is long. And that's the only description, long hair. Now, how long is too long? Well, that, people can debate that, but really it's not difficult to come to a reasonable conclusion. In Ezekiel 44, and I don't want you to turn there, but you can just write it down if you want to look it up. In Ezekiel 44, in verse 20, it's talking about the millennial temple when Christ returns. And of course, the same standards for the millennial temple in the future applied to the temple in the past and the priesthood thereof. And it says that they shall, speaking of the priests of the temple, it says, they shall neither shave their heads nor let their hair grow long, but they shall keep their hair well trimmed. So this is a standard for priests, and it doesn't say that it's a standard for all men, but it's a possible indicator that, well, this is what God prefers. On the other hand, if a man, for example, if a man is taking the vow of a Nazirite, well, his hair is naturally going to get long. You're not allowed to shave your hair at all, anywhere on your body, head, face, anywhere. You're not allowed to shave your hair if you're in the period of that vow. It appears, for example, that Paul took of the vow of a Nazirite in Acts 18. It lasted probably for more than a year and until he cut his hair. But Jesus, he did not have long hair, as artists have portrayed down through the centuries. He was a Nazarene, not a Nazirite. And Paul would never say something like that we just read if Christ had long hair. So among styles for men, well trimmed, we can debate what that means. But, Paul's instructions that we had read in 1 Corinthians, that clearly was in line with men not looking like women, and of course women not looking like men applies as well. It's a standard that is timeless regardless of culture and fashion. Among the styles of hair for men that are proper, some like to have their hair trimmed around the ears, some like a little bit of length, some combed back so that their entire forehead is showing. There are many styles that can, be had for men and their hair. But the same principles apply for men as it does for women. It's what's proper, what's modest. And as a related side, bangs are not evil for men or women. There's nothing in the scriptures that say thou shalt not have bangs. It's a matter of preference, whether a man or a woman. It doesn't make a difference, or at least a moral difference. Everybody has an opinion of how hair should be, but our opinions are to be formed based upon what the scriptures apply or imply and what they actually say. Leviticus 19, let's go all the way back to the Torah for a bit. For the man, or men, something that was once controversial is facial hair. Now, for the last few decades, beards have become quite trendy, haven't they? You see them a lot more today than you have in past centuries, or I should say, not centuries, decades, past decades. A favored style of many has been for several decades now the goatee, which is kind of how I wear my facial hair. It's a choice, but it's a choice that some of us have to make because some of us don't grow much hair here, and it just is kind of scraggly and strange looking. So I choose to, cut my facial hair in that way, and many do, but others do it just because they like the way that it looks. But at one time, those who had a goatee were considered sinister. or people of ill repute. And that may have been due, at least in part, to Leviticus 19 and verse 27, where it says of men, "You shall not shave around the sides of your head, nor shall you disfigure the edges of your beard." Now, exactly what kind of shaving around the corners, sides of your head, or disfiguring the beard means is not entirely certain. The apostle who led the Church of God for 50 years or so said that elders could not have goatees until it was considered acceptable to our culture. Now, eventually it was acceptable, and that was then allowed among ministers. Now, Mr. Armstrong, he knew the goatee was not evil in and of itself. He didn't associate it with a disfigured beard in Leviticus 19. But society had looked at them for some time as being something that villains had, even portrayed in cartoons and in old movies. The villains had a goatee. There are many styles of facial hair today. There's the kind of like the Amish style where they'll shave the mustache and just have hair kind of coming around here. There's people with just a mustache. There's like the barbershop fashion, or some people have the little, like, what do they call them? The handles. They're like kind of, what do they call them? Handlebars, yeah, on the mustache. They're all aspects of fashion and also culture. Now, because they are all socially acceptable, today, it makes it difficult to discern exactly what God was telling Israel in Leviticus 19:27, what he was telling them to avoid doing. My studies indicate that he was likely referring to the way in which many Egyptians had rounded the corners of their hair on their head and fashioned a straight beard that came straight off of their faces. And in that culture, it wasn't symbolic of a phallic symbol, as some have assumed, but it was symbolic of having a connection to their gods. Exactly why they chose that symbolism, I do not know, but I know that it is a fact, and Egyptologists will say that that is why they did it. And God, he had brought Israel along with a mixed multitude out of Egypt, out of that culture. And just because Israel now understood who the true God was and that they were going to be considered a special people to himself, I think he was saying, don't attempt to connect yourself to deity by looking like they did. Shaving their heads or having their beards as a sign of being a connection to their gods. I don't want you doing the same type of thing. Come out of her, my people, who said, be different from that culture. And since we are in this section here of the Bible, I want to briefly consider permanent markings on the body that are known as tattoos. So tattoos have been around for thousands of years, and people who choose to get them may get them for a variety of reasons. Perhaps it's in honor of someone who had passed or something that we are very fond of. In our culture, tattoos were once associated with, again, people who might be considered ruffians or hooligans or people of low character. In many ways, some people do put them in that category. But there are a growing number of people getting tattoos, and it's becoming more and more acceptable in our culture, and many people will even get tattoos with scriptures tattooed on their arms or their legs, or other religious symbols, whether it be crosses, or I've seen some with a Star of David tattooed on them. But there is a scripture here in Leviticus 19:28 that says don't do it. It says, "You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks on you. I am the Eternal." God often ends instruction by saying, "I am the Eternal," basically saying, here's this is my stamp of authority. Don't do this. I am the Eternal. be holy as he is holy. It's kind of like it's implying that in the instruction. Now, the King James Version of this scripture says, nor print any marks upon you, which means the same thing. You know, tattoos, they would be a violation of this instruction. Now, if someone in the church has tattoos, or, you know, somebody might be visiting the congregation or church service has them, I don't think it's necessary to say, yeah, that's not welcome here. I think it would be improper to do that. I would not do it. I don't think it would be necessary for those people that are coming into the body of the church to have those tattoos removed, unless, of course, that it was something that was obscene. If it's not obscene, you know, the past is the past. We're going forward, you know. My advice would be, don't get any more tattoos. As an argument, now this is an argument I have not heard, but it's an argument that I thought of while going through all of these topics. Because some aspects of these laws about appearance, such as rounding the beard or braiding the hair, as we talked about, what Paul had said, they have to do with culture. Is it possible that tattoos fall into the same category? I would say that it doesn't. That's my, you know, studied opinion of the matter. But if you're somebody who thinks that it does fall into the same category, I'll entertain the argument. We can talk about it. Might be an interesting discussion. I don't think I'm going to be convinced otherwise, but hey, we're open to hear it. The ministerial position is to forbear from tattoos. Let's go back a bit further to Genesis in chapter 24. The last topic that I want to mention today is piercings. And piercings, they also go back thousands of years. It was interesting when I was looking up some of the history of piercings. I saw that there was some mummified remains of a man who was crossing the Alps, must have been caught in a snowstorm or something, and his body was frozen there. They say that his body dates back 5,000 years, and it shows that he had a pierced ear. Nose piercings are also dated to thousands of years ago, as early as 1500 BC, and most prevalent in Middle Eastern cultures. Other body piercings beside the ear and the nose are limited to primitive tribes of Africa, or perhaps the Aztec and Mayan cultures who pierced their lips and tongues. At least the warriors did. But some of this has been showing up in Western culture in the last decade or so, and it shows up among people who want to appear, you know, radical or have a shock value to it. But I'm talking about some of the unusual facial piercings. Ear piercing became, and you know, it's just a generation I can relate to. Ear piercing became a symbol of rebellion among young men or teenagers or men in the 1970s, late 70s in the punk culture. But it was also used by some to indicate that they were homosexual. And all, you know, me and my friends, we all understood if you got an ear pierce on your right ear, that was considered to be a sign of homosexuality, a kind of a subtle sign. But if the left, hey, that's okay, you know, if you wanted to get those. For many centuries, pierced ears were limited to women, at least in Western culture. But there are examples of men and women who had piercings in the Bible. One example is Abraham, and this comes from Abraham's desire to find a suitable wife for his son Isaac, and he therefore sent a servant off a distance back to Ur of the Chaldees to find a suitable bride. And it says in Genesis 24 and verse 22 that he took a golden nose ring and he gave it to the woman who he found. that would be suitable for Isaac. Now, retelling the encounter, and I'm going to read verse 47, Genesis 24 and verse 47. It says, and this is the servant talking to Abraham, says, "Then I asked her," speaking of this woman, "and said, 'Whose daughter are you?' And she said, 'The daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him.'" And so the servant understood this is a suitable woman to be a bride for Isaac. And it says, "So I put the nose ring on her nose and bracelets on her wrists." Now, the King James version of this scripture says, "I put the earring upon her face," which sounds a little strange. So nose ring is the Hebrew word nezem, meaning an earring or a nose ring. But af means nose or nostril. So I think in this particular scripture, the New King James Version has a more accurate rendering. Clearly, Abraham would have supplied this servant with the precious gifts to give to a woman, including a nose ring. Now, in our culture, nose rings have been uncommon and sometimes considered radical or shocking, but only for cultural reasons, not because there's anything wrong with them. There's nothing immoral about nose rings unless, of course, the intent is to appear radical or rebellious. Exodus 21, if you'd go forward to Exodus in chapter 21, there are some other examples that I will just mention briefly as we're turning the page or pages. Genesis 35 and verse 4 is an example of earrings that were worn by women, likely fashioned with inappropriate images, but the earrings themselves were not the problem. Judges chapter 8 and verse 24 associates men who wore earrings to being descendants of Ishmael. Now, Ishmael, along with Esau, became the Arab peoples, but the earrings were of no concern. They were not immoral. In Exodus in chapter 21, there's an example of God telling certain men to get their ears pierced for a particular reason. And this was the case if there were indentured servants who wanted to remain in that position of a servant to this particular person or family when the time of servitude was complete. And God said that if this is the case, in verse 5, "But if the servant plainly says, 'I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free,' then his master shall bring him to the judges, and he shall also bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever." And so a permanent life of servitude. This is evidence, again, more evidence, I should say, that, those people who were servants, which would be in the category of slaves in Egypt, they were not all mistreated, that they were treated kindly and treated well. It even indicates that, the servant was, would have a wife and children in their time of service. Or at least they were allowed that if they wanted it. So this was not a matter of fashion, but it is a matter of culture. And it was a God-given symbol, therefore, to men who wanted a lifelong service to a person or family. And piercings were acceptable in this regard for men and also women of that culture. Another example is Exodus 32, where Aaron told Israel to break off the golden earrings which are in your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. Now, of course, the immoral issue was using that precious metal to fashion an idol, but the immoral issue was not the earring itself. Ezekiel in chapter 16, and we're getting toward the end here, Ezekiel 16. There's another example here which is very interesting. And this is where God describes Israel as to having a body, and he's talking about the people as a whole, and he's describing them as having a body with accessories. And it's a description symbolic of his blessing to Israel when he had established them as a nation after bringing them out of Egypt. And it says in Ezekiel 16, in verse 9, "Then I washed you in water. Yes, I thoroughly washed off your blood, and I anointed you with oil." And it's talking about cleansing them of their sin from living in a life of sin among idolatrous people, of which they partook of the idolatry. Many people don't realize that. And I have several scriptures listed showing that they were participants in the idolatry of Egypt. "I anointed you with oil. I clothed you in embroidered cloth and gave you sandals of badger skin. I clothed you with fine linen and covered you with silk. I adorned you with ornaments, put bracelets on your wrists and a chain on your neck. And I put a jewel in your nose, earrings in your ears, and a beautiful crown on your head." So these terms that are used are according to fine things of that culture. And they're symbolic, yes, but they have meaning. They were actual items that people wore and used. And they were considered things of value, things of beauty. And the way in which God describes them being used is proper. It's likened to adorning a bride. And Israel was a type of Christ's future bride. Now, none of this means that, men should wear earrings or women should have pierced noses. The point is, I want for people to understand, is that we can't frown on people that might have them because it doesn't actually align with the ethics of the Bible. The question for those who choose to wear them is, again, what's proper? What's our motivation? What do we hope to achieve when styling our hair in a particular way, or wearing makeup, or buying certain types of clothes, or piercing the ear or the nose? Fashion and culture, they are not evil in and of themselves. It is how they are used that can lean in that direction. Now, to some people, styles reflect character. And the opinion that some might have in that regard, it may not always be an accurate assessment. But we don't want to give wrong impressions, open the door to wrong impressions, because it's possible that our liberty can be an offense to some. It might cause some to stumble. And both Christ and Paul had made the same points. And Christ said in Luke 17 and verse 1 that it is impossible that no offenses should come. In other words, people are going to get offended. It's almost like you're never going to be able to stop people from getting offended entirely. But he said, a lot does depend on us. He says, woe to him or her through whom they do come. So in other words, be cautious. Think about it. And this doesn't only work one way. I don't want us to think that it works one way. I'm not just talking to people who might, have a certain appearance. I'm talking also to people who might be offended by something that is not appealing to us, something that we don't agree with, and we don't actually have a biblical reason for it. We just, it's not a part of the culture we grew up in. It's not what we're used to, and we don't really like it. Because think about it. We don't know the person's mind. We don't know their heart. We don't understand exactly where they're coming from. And instead, we should therefore practice the fruits of kindness, of gentleness, of compassion, of giving people the benefit of the doubt. I've even heard examples of some who came to services and they were dressed or wore their hair improperly while attending a congregation, and they were told that they had to, either cut their hair before they come back or dress a different way before they return. And some of these people never came back. That's an offense to them. I don't think it's right. And it may be an offense to God. Maybe he wanted them to come to get something out of it. But they never, Again, God's not going to micromanage, so they never took it a step further. Now, for those who enjoy clothes or hair or, a piercing that might be considered atypical, doesn't violate the scripture, but we might know that this could be offensive to some. It might give others the wrong impression. We have a choice to do it or not. And think about it, if you think this kind of limits your ability to choose this or that, there are so many things to be enjoyed. We have so many options in our culture to wear a variety of clothes or have a variety of hairstyles or jewelry. It's so much to choose from. And on a much deeper level, consider again what God expressed through the Apostle Peter, who said, "Let your adornment be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God."